So our first speaker is Dr. Bhanu Sharma. His research interests lie at the intersection of concussion, neuroimaging, and exercise science. He aims to keep a multidisciplinary perspective to advance the field with new insights. And recently, he completed his first marathon in 2021, and apparently he's still recovering. So we're looking forward to your talk, Dr. Bhanu Sharma.
Okay, thank you, Joe, and thank you everybody for joining. My name is Bhanu Sharma, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about rethinking concussions. So when we hear about concussions, our minds, mine included, may be drawn first to sport. And sport's actually a really good example of an area in which there's been considerable rethinking of concussion. And this has led to some meaningful change with respect to, for example, how the injury is perceived. And to expand on that, I'm going to reference our national pastime of hockey. And here's a picture from many years ago with Eric Lindros in the middle of the screen. And during his prime, he was known as a bit of a bruiser, I suppose, and he handed out many hits, many of which were celebrated, even though they might have led to some injury in the opposition. But later in his career, as many of us know, Eric Lindros suffered a number of concussions himself. And these injuries led to some complications that forced him to take time away from the game and may potentially have even led to an earlier retirement. Now, as I mentioned at the top, it's important to rethink concussions because it changes the way that, for example, the injury is perceived. And that's in large part and thanks to individuals like Eric, who now retired, is working to try to make the game safer for youth. So I'm presenting this example because it shows the power of rethinking concussion. So it upturned the status quo. We had concussions accepted as a byproduct of the game. It's now being seen as something that needs to be removed in the interest of player health. And I want to use this example to draw on a larger point. So there is rethinking ongoing in other areas of concussion as well. And more specifically, scientists, including myself and other researchers at McMaster University, we're rethinking how concussion can best be managed. And this is leading to exciting new findings that are upturning the way we thought about concussion management and setting a new standard. Now, before I get into that in a little bit more detail, I do think it's important for us to come up with a working definition of concussion for this talk, just because there are a number of different resources out there, and I think it's important we get on the same page for defining a concussion, at least for this talk. And here we can consider concussion a mild brain injury caused by a hit to the body that shakes the brain, as seen here on the left in this dramatized animation. And concussions are injuries that can happen without being knocked out. And they're injuries that can lead to different types of symptoms in different people. So it's often said that no two concussions are alike. With respect to the big, bad, and ugly of concussion, so it is a big problem, and we know this. So there's about 150,000 people in Ontario who get a concussion every year. And these rates are rising, particularly in youth and the elderly. The bad is that there can be many different types of symptoms with concussion that can be tough to manage, and they can have an impact on perceived quality of life. And the ugly is that, unfortunately, up to 30% of people who get a concussion can develop long-term symptoms. And these are symptoms that last on the scale of months and in rare instances, years. Now, traditional treatments for concussion were ineffective. These were taking a passive approach to avoid secondary injuries rather than a proactive approach towards recovery. And this happened because we knew that having 2 concussions in a short period was worse than having 1, and 3 was worse than 2, and so on and so forth. So this led to a model where injury avoidance was prioritized over proactive recovery of the initial injury. And in turn, this may have led to what you may have heard of as a dark room approach, where patients were told to rest in a dark room until their symptoms naturally resolved. Or athletes, recreational and professional, were told to take time away from sport and avoid contact and drills and other things. And children were often advised to stay away from the classroom because the classroom can be overstimulated. Now, some of these recommendations are important, such as avoiding contact by playing sports soon after a concussion, because we do want to avoid those secondary injuries. But we also need to move towards a more proactive approach that targets management of the original injury itself. Nonetheless, rest was thought to be best for concussion, and rest was prescribed after a concussion until symptoms naturally improved. But as mentioned at the top, there has been some rethinking of how concussions should be managed, and this is changing the way we are approaching injury management. Now, it's actually thought that exercise can be medicine for concussion, and this is upturning the prior rest is best status quo. So scientists have found that low to moderate intensity exercise or cardio training on a treadmill or a stationary bike is actually better than rest after a concussion. So instead of resting for the entirety of the day and hoping that symptoms naturally resolve, we can take a more proactive approach. And there's data now to suggest that breaking up your day, breaking up that prolonged period of rest with a bout of low intensity exercise on a treadmill or a bike can actually improve outcome. And there's also some data from the on adult concussion that suggests that breaking up your day with bouts of physical activity, so maybe going for a walk or taking a dog for a walk, things of that nature, can also improve concussion outcome. And a combination of the two has also a better effect than rest following concussion. So exercise, as our evidence base now suggests, can help improve many of the symptoms and complications caused by a concussion. And here we have a common symptom scale, which has 2021 items, and it's used to measure different symptoms associated with a concussion. And there's a large amount of data now that suggests that actually exercise is improving symptoms in those with a concussion. We also have some data on adult concussion, which should suggest that exercise can improve some mental health outcomes. And we are working here at McMaster University to understand the effects of exercise on brain function in children with concussion, because after all, concussions are brain injuries. Now, here's an example of being a little bit impatient with the status quo and changing the status quo help concussion patients improve. So if you think about it, rest and exercise are completely opposite management strategies. They've been called diametrically opposed by some of the researchers in the field. But challenging the status quo and rethinking concussion helped us adopt a completely new strategy towards managing concussion, and this is helping many patients. So it's a story of how science can upturn norms to better patient health. And I think the story of concussion is just one example of how science can not only create important but incremental change, but also shift paradigms entirely when you maybe rethink of a problem. I'd like to thank everybody for their time and the McCall McLean Foundation and the organizers, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So we actually do have a couple of questions from the audience. Why do concussions reoccur after head impacts, and what affects severity?
So this is a great question. So in terms of the first part, the part A, I guess, into why secondary injuries occur, we're coming up with mechanisms and we're understanding more. I think there still is some more to be understood here. There's some vulnerability, especially acutely in the days after concussion, for sustaining a secondary injury. And there was a tragic report of a rugby player in Ontario, Rowan Stringer, who unfortunately passed away from multiple injuries in a short succession. But we're working towards understanding why this vulnerability exactly exists. And the second question about severity is a good one. So I know there are, for example, my postdoc supervisor, Mike Noseworthy, is quite interested in this and quantifying the severity of a concussion. There's lots of factors that play into this. No two injuries are the same. The impact is different. The way it's perceived is different. Things like neck strength affect how many shear forces may be translated to the brain. So we're working towards a better measure of concussion severity, and we recognize that's important, but I don't know if we have a graded scale or anything right now.
Maybe that's the next direction for some research. Where did the notion that rest was beneficial come from? When for the most other bodily injuries, moderate exercise or physiotherapy is encouraged?
Right, that's a good question. So the rest is best approach was kind of motivated again by avoiding that secondary injury. By activity might cause a slip or a trip, or in sports you might have a collision. So it was really motivated by a goal of avoiding a secondary injury, because we know that 2 injuries and 3 injuries and so on can have compounding and more severe effects. So the rest is best approach was really a passive approach towards management and hoping to avoid further injuries down the road.
Fantastic, thank you. And actually, we just got another one in that's just come in right now. So people are asking about the brain fog that's typical of long COVID, or perhaps with Lyme disease. It seems like some of these symptoms are actually quite similar to a concussion. Do you think that the research could be similar?
It's really interesting. So a lot of the concussion symptoms on symptom scales are relatively non-specific, and there is, feeling in a fog or fogginess that's included as one of the common concussion symptoms. From what I know about what we do know currently about the brain fog and COVID, it seems like it probably will be a different mechanism. So maybe it's something biologically that's happening differently, but it's being experienced in a similar way, would be my best guess right now. But I do think they may be different constructs.
Fantastic. And one final question for you. So you mentioned, dog walking, and some people want you to maybe give an idea about the length of exercise that has been studying, and can you use something like paddling, running, or weights?
Sure. So that's a good question. So I didn't get into this too much in the talk, but when we're prescribing exercise now, so we have tests that we can do in the lab on a treadmill or a stationary bike, which we get a sense of what kind of exercise you can tolerate. And it's based on what heart rate you can achieve without experiencing symptoms. And then based on that, a program can be structured. And it's typically, if you're following the exercise prescription, it's 20 minutes of exercise at 80% of the peak heart rate you achieved during that test in the lab or in the clinic. And you do that about 5 days a week and then slowly build your tolerance. And a goal of the exercise is to really engage the autonomic nervous system, which is a big branch of our nervous system, which seems to be impaired in concussion. And the exercise is actually a great way to create the biological change that we need to help address that type of pathology and concussion. I'll leave some time for my other fellows, but I'll just say quickly, weights is probably unadvisable just because of maneuvers where there's more breath holding or static positions. There might be some intolerance with respect to changes in cerebral blood flow, so that might not be a great idea. Paddling, I cannot say I've seen anything, but just in terms of doing something a little bit more low risk to still get active, I think a treadmill or a stationary bike is your best bet.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Bonu. I hope I don't need to ever use your advice, but I have it.